First, we'll dive into the case of the Springfield Three. They say the most haunting mysteries are the ones where people seem to vanish into thin air. But what happens when not just one person disappears, but three women vanish from the same house, leaving behind everything they own? How do two teenagers celebrating their high school graduation and a mother waiting up for her daughter simply cease to exist? Today, we're diving into one of the most baffling missing persons cases in American history, the disappearance of the Springfield Three. A case that has left investigators scratching their heads for over 3 decades, and a community forever changed by the events of one summer night in 1992. But before we get into the mysterious circumstances of their disappearance, let's get to know the three women whose lives were forever altered that fateful night. Cheryl Levitt was what you might call a supermom. At 47 years old, she'd built a successful career as a cosmetologist at a local salon while raising her daughter as a single mother. Friends described her as hardworking, dedicated, and absolutely devoted to her daughter Suzanne. Standing just 5 feet tall with short blonde hair and a warm smile, Cheryl was the kind of person who made everyone feel welcome in her home. Her daughter, Suzanne Susie Streeter, was just 19 and full of life. With shoulder-length blonde hair and a distinctive small tumor in the corner of her mouth that made it look like she was always hiding a piece of candy, Susie was known for her outgoing personality and close relationship with her mom. The two had recently moved into their home at 1717 East Delmar Street, excited to start a new chapter together. Then there was Stacy McCall, Susie's friend and fellow graduate. At 18 years old, with long, dark blonde hair and a dimple in her chin, Stacy had her whole life ahead of her. She was close with her parents, Janice and Stuart McCall, and had big plans for her future after high school. June 6, 1992, should have been one of the happiest days of their lives. Susie and Stacy were graduating from Kickapoo High School, and the atmosphere was electric with excitement. Cheryl beamed with pride as she watched her daughter walk across the stage at the Hammond Student Center. No one could have imagined that in less than 24 hours, all three women would vanish without a trace. The graduation celebrations were in full swing. Susie and Stacy, like many of their classmates, had planned a night of party hopping to celebrate their achievement. They started the evening at their friend Janelle Kirby's house in Battlefield, a small community near Springfield. The girls were in high spirits, laughing and talking about their plans for the future. As the night wore on, they made their way through several graduation parties. At their last stop, around 2 a.m. on June 7th, they made a decision that would unknowingly change everything. The original plan had been to spend the night at Kirby's house, but when they realized it was crowded with out-of-town relatives, Susie suggested they head back to her house instead. She was excited to show Stacy her new king-sized waterbed. Meanwhile, back at the house on East Delmar, Cheryl had last been heard from around 11:15 p.m. She'd been on the phone with a friend, chatting about painting an armoire in her bedroom, a perfectly normal conversation that gave no hint of the nightmare about to unfold. The next morning, when Janelle Kirby and her boyfriend arrived at the house to meet up with Susie and Stacy for their planned trip to Whitewater Park, they found something odd. The door was unlocked, and while all three women's cars were parked outside, the house was eerily quiet. Even stranger was the broken porch light globe, its glass scattered across the front step. But what they discovered inside the house would launch one of the most perplexing investigations in Missouri history. All three women's purses were lined up on the floor. Their clothes, jewelry, and cigarettes were exactly where you'd expect them to be. Cheryl's purse still contained $800 in cash from a recent salon deposit. A half-finished can of Coke sat next to Susie's cigarettes. The TV in Susie's room was still on, showing static, as if they'd fallen asleep watching a movie and simply vanished. When Janelle picked up a call to the house that morning, she was met with something disturbing, an unknown male voice making sexual innuendos. She hung up, only to receive another similar call moments later. These mysterious calls would later become just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Yet perhaps the most haunting detail was the presence of Cheryl and Susie's beloved Yorkshire Terrier, Cinnamon. The usually friendly dog was acting strangely agitated, as if it had witnessed something during the night that had left it deeply disturbed. Stay with us because as we dig deeper into this mystery, we'll uncover even more baffling details about what happened that night. We'll explore the massive investigation that followed, the strange leads that went nowhere, and the theories that have kept investigators awake at night for decades. But first, if you're enjoying this deep dive into one of America's most puzzling missing persons cases, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. When Stacy McCall's mother, Janice, arrived at the house that afternoon, her maternal instincts told her something was terribly wrong. The scene was almost too normal, as if the women had simply stepped out for a moment and would return any second. But they didn't, and what happened next would haunt investigators for decades. While checking the answering machine for any clues to the women's whereabouts, Janice listened to what police would later call a strange message. But in a cruel twist of fate, this potentially crucial piece of evidence was accidentally erased, a common occurrence with answering machines in the 90s. To this day, no one knows what that message contained, or if it might have held the key to solving the mystery. The Springfield Police Department faced a unique challenge. This wasn't just any missing persons case. They had 3 missing women, no signs of forced entry, and a crime scene that had been unknowingly compromised by well-meaning friends and family. By the time investigators could properly process the scene, between 10 and 20 people had walked through the house, potentially destroying crucial evidence. Detective David Asher, one of the first investigators assigned to the case, later stated, "The scene was pristine in terms of violence, but contaminated in terms of evidence. It was like they had been plucked out of their lives by some unseen force." The initial search revealed some peculiar details. Cheryl's bed appeared to have been slept in. A window blind was bent at an odd angle. All personal belongings, including purses, money, and cars, remained untouched. The women's clothing from the previous night was folded neatly. Recently used makeup removal pads were found in the bathroom. But perhaps most intriguing was what they didn't find. No signs of a struggle, no evidence of forced entry, and no blood or other indicators of violence. The disappearance of the Springfield Three, as they came to be known, sent shockwaves through the community. Local news coverage was constant, and volunteers poured in to help with the search efforts. Missing person posters featuring the 3 women's faces became a common sight throughout Missouri. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing additional resources and expertise. But even with federal involvement, solid leads remained elusive. Every potential clue seemed to lead to another dead end. On December 31, 1992, investigators received what seemed like a promising break. A man called the America's Most Wanted hotline with information about the abductions. Police would later say this caller had prime knowledge of what happened. But just as they tried to connect him with Springfield investigators, the call disconnected. Despite public appeals, the mysterious caller never reached out again. As with any investigation of this magnitude, several persons of interest emerged. One of the first was Dustin Rekla, Susie Streeter's former boyfriend. Months before the disappearances, Rekla had been involved in a bizarre incident, breaking into a local mausoleum and stealing gold fillings from a skull. Susie had given a statement about the break-in and was potentially going to testify against him, but Rekla and his friends had alibis for the night in question, and investigators couldn't find any concrete evidence linking them to the disappearances. Then there was the curious case of Robert Craig Cox. In 1997, Cox, who was imprisoned in Texas for other crimes, made a chilling statement to journalists. He claimed he knew the 3 women had been murdered, and that their bodies would never be recovered. Even more disturbing, Cox had been living in Springfield in 1992. When initially questioned, Cox claimed he was at church with his girlfriend the morning after the disappearances. She corroborated his story, at first. But later, she recanted, admitting Cox had asked her to lie for him. Despite this revelation, investigators couldn't definitively connect Cox to the crime. Cox would later tell authorities he would reveal what happened to the women after his mother died, adding another layer of mystery to an already complex case. One of the most persistent theories about the fate of the Springfield Three involves the Cox Hospital parking garage. Years after the disappearance, investigators received a tip suggesting the women's bodies were buried in the foundation of the south parking garage. In 2007, reporter Kathy Baird brought in Rick Norland, a mechanical engineer with ground-penetrating radar equipment. What they found was intriguing. 3 anomalies, roughly the same size that Norland said were consistent with grave sites. 2 were parallel, and 1 was perpendicular. However, the Springfield Police Department had reservations. Spokesperson Lisa Cox pointed out that construction on the parking garage didn't begin until September 1993, more than a year after the disappearances. The cost of excavating and reconstructing the structure would be enormous, and without more concrete evidence, authorities couldn't justify the expense. Adding another layer of skepticism, former Greene County Assistant Prosecutor Darrell Moore revealed that the tip had come from someone claiming to be psychic or to have had a dream about the case. 32 years have passed since that summer night in Springfield, Missouri. The graduating class of '92 is now in their 50s. The young police officers who first worked the case have since retired. And still, the question remains, what happened to the Springfield Three? For Janice McCall, Stacy's mother, the years haven't dulled the pain of loss. She's dedicated her life to helping other families of missing persons, turning her tragedy into a mission to prevent others from experiencing the same heartache. The not knowing is the hardest part, Janice has said in interviews. You can't fully grieve because there's always that small hope that maybe, just maybe, you'll get answers. The case has left an indelible mark on Springfield. The house at 1717 East Delmar Street still stands, though different families have lived there over the years. Local residents say newcomers to the neighborhood often don't know the history, but longtime residents never forget. In June 1997, 5 years after the disappearances, a bench was dedicated to the women inside the victims' memorial garden in Springfield's Phelps Grove Park. It serves as a quiet reminder of the 3 lives interrupted that night and the questions that still haunt this community. The case has been featured on numerous true crime shows including 48 Hours, America's Most Wanted, and Investigation Discoveries Disappeared. Each new telling brings a fresh wave of tips, but so far none have led to a breakthrough. The Springfield Police Department maintains an active file on the case, and tips still come in, over 5,000 to date. But the challenges grow with each passing year. Physical evidence that might have contained DNA has degraded. Witnesses' memories have faded. Some people who might have had crucial information have passed away. Yet investigators refuse to give up hope. Detective Larry Woods, who worked the case for years, stated, "This isn't just another cold case for us. These were 3 members of our community who vanished without a trace. We owe it to their families to keep searching for answers." Over the years, numerous theories have emerged about what might have happened that night. Some investigators believe the women knew their abductor, given the lack of forced entry and the seemingly peaceful state of the house. Others think it might have been a crime of opportunity, someone who noticed the broken porch light and took advantage of the situation. The mystery of the erased answering machine message continues to intrigue investigators. What was on that recording? Was it a random prank call or something more sinister? And what about Robert Craig Cox's cryptic statement about revealing the truth after his mother's death? Was it a genuine confession or the manipulative game of a convicted criminal seeking attention? The disappearance of the Springfield Three changed how missing persons cases are handled in Missouri. Law enforcement now responds more quickly to missing adults cases, especially when circumstances are suspicious. The case also highlighted the importance of preserving crime scenes and preventing contamination by well-meaning civilians. But perhaps the most significant legacy is how it affected the community itself. Springfield residents became more cautious, more aware of their surroundings. Parents had difficult conversations with their children about safety. And a generation of young people learned that sometimes the most frightening things can happen on the most ordinary nights. As we wrap up this exploration of one of America's most perplexing mysteries, we're left with more questions than answers. 3 women, a mother and 2 recent high school graduates, disappeared without a trace, leaving behind all their possessions and a community forever changed by their absence. Somewhere, someone knows what happened that night in June 1992. Until they come forward, the Springfield 3 remains one of the most haunting, unsolved mysteries in American history. If you have any information about the disappearance of Cheryl Levitt, Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall, please contact the Springfield Police Department or your local FBI office. Even the smallest detail could be the key to solving this decades-old mystery. What do you think happened to the Springfield 3? Share your theories in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime investigations. Remember, every share of this video could help reach someone who might have information about this case. Together, we can keep their memory alive, and maybe, just maybe, help bring answers to their families. Next, we'll explore the Circleville letters. They say small towns keep the biggest secrets, but in Circleville, Ohio, someone decided those secrets weren't staying buried. For nearly 2 decades, an anonymous writer terrorized this quiet community with thousands of threatening letters, exposing affairs, corruption, and even murder. The letters destroyed lives, tore families apart, and led to one man spending a decade behind bars. But was he really the Circleville letter writer? The story I'm about to tell you isn't just about poison pen letters. It's about betrayal, revenge, and a mystery that would haunt this small Midwestern town for generations. A mystery that begins with a single letter delivered to a school bus driver named Mary Gillespie in 1977. Picture this. Mary, an attractive woman who'd been crowned Miss Jackson in high school, living what seemed to be a perfect small-town life. She had a loving husband named Ron, 2 beautiful children, and a steady job driving a school bus for the local district. But one day, she opened her mailbox and found a letter that would shatter her world forever. The message was crystal clear. Stay away from Massey. I've been observing your house and know you have children. This is no joke. Please take it serious. The writer was referring to Gordon Massey, the married superintendent of schools, and accusing Mary of having an affair with him. Now, before we dive deeper into this rabbit hole, I want you to understand something about Circleville, Ohio. This wasn't just any small town. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least thought they did. The kind of place where the biggest event of the year was the pumpkin show, and where families had lived for generations, their lives intertwined like threads in a tapestry. But someone was about to tear that tapestry apart, thread by bloody thread. Mary tried to ignore that first letter, hoping it would go away. But the writer was just getting started. More letters arrived, each one more threatening than the last. I know you are a pig, one letter sneered, and will prove it and shame you out of Ohio. The writer didn't just target Mary. They sent letters to her husband Ron, to Gordon Massey, to the school board, to local newspapers. The threats escalated. The writer warned that if Mary didn't confess to the affair, a bullet would be put in her little girl's head. Desperate to end the harassment, Mary and Ron reached out to family members for help. Along with Ron's sister Karen and her husband Paul Freshour, they compiled a list of possible suspects. They even sent letters to each suspect warning them to stop. For a brief moment it seemed to work. The letters stopped. But that moment of peace was about to be shattered in the most tragic way possible. On August 19, 1977, Ron Gillespie received a phone call that would be his last. His daughter watched as her father, enraged by whatever the caller had said, grabbed his gun and stormed out to his truck. Ron told her he knew who the letter writer was and he was going to confront them. He never came home. Later that night, Ron's truck was found wrapped around a tree. He was dead inside, with a blood alcohol level well above the legal limit. Strange, since Ron wasn't known to be a heavy drinker. Even more puzzling, his gun was found under his body and it had been fired once. The official ruling was accident, but many in Circleville weren't buying it. After all, the letter writer had threatened Ron's life if he didn't expose his wife's alleged affair. And now, he was dead. The letters didn't stop with Ron's death. If anything, they became more frequent, more vicious. The writer seemed to know everything about everyone in town. They accused the sheriff of covering up Ron's death. They claimed the county coroner was molesting children. They exposed affairs, embezzlement, and murder. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. After Ron's death, Mary Gillespie and Gordon Massey, who had always denied having an affair, began seeing each other openly. The letter writer's accusations had been true all along. The writer's rage reached new heights. Signs began appearing along Mary's bus route, crude messages about her and her young daughter. But on February 7, 1983, the letter writer made a fatal mistake, one that would finally give investigators their first real break in the case. That morning, Mary spotted another sign along her route, but this one was different. When she tried to tear it down, she discovered it was rigged to a box. Inside that box was a loaded gun, ready to fire when the sign was pulled. The booby trap failed, but it would lead investigators to a suspect no one saw coming. And that's where our story takes its darkest turn. The gun in that booby trap? It belonged to Paul Freshour, Ron Gillespie's own brother-in-law, the same man who had helped search for the letter writer years before. But as investigators would soon discover, this case was far from simple. Paul Freshour seemed an unlikely suspect. He was well-educated, with a master's degree and a good job as a manager at Anheuser-Busch. He had no criminal record, and by all accounts, was a devoted family man. But his ex-wife Karen, Ron Gillespie's sister, had a different story to tell. Karen had recently gone through a bitter divorce with Paul. When investigators questioned her about the gun, she dropped a bombshell. She claimed Paul was the Circleville letter writer. She told them she had found torn-up letters in their toilet and others hidden around their house. But when asked to produce these letters, Karen said she had thrown them all away. Now let me pause here for a moment because this is where things get interesting. Karen was living in a trailer on Mary Gillespie's property after losing her home in the divorce. She had lost custody of their children to Paul, and suddenly she's the first person to connect Paul to the letters. But the evidence against Paul was mounting. When investigators asked him to copy the handwriting from the anonymous letters, a highly unusual request that would never be allowed today, 2 handwriting experts concluded he was the writer. Even more damning, Paul failed a polygraph test. Picture this. October 24, 1983, the Pickaway County Courthouse in Circleville. Paul Freshour goes on trial, not for writing the letters, but for attempted murder, the booby trap meant for Mary Gillespie. The prosecution's strategy was clear: convince the jury that the letter writer and the person who set the trap were one and the same. Despite having an alibi for the day the booby trap was found, despite no fingerprints on the gun or the box, despite the fact that Paul had readily admitted the gun was his but claimed it had been stolen, the jury found him guilty. The sentence 7 to 25 years in prison. Case closed, right? The letter writer was behind bars, and Circleville could sleep easy again. Except for one small problem. The letters kept coming. Not just a few letters. Hundreds of them. All postmarked from Columbus just like before. Letters to newspapers, to TV stations, to random citizens. Even Paul Freshour himself received one in prison. It read, "Now when are you going to believe you aren't getting out of there? I told you 2 years ago when we set 'em up, they stay set up." The prison warden insisted it was impossible for Paul to be writing these letters. He was kept in isolation, stripped of pen and paper, his mail strictly monitored. Yet still, the letters came. But here's where our story takes another turn. A female bus driver came forward with information that had never been mentioned at trial. 20 minutes before Mary found the booby trap, this driver had seen something crucial. A large man with sandy hair standing beside a yellow El Camino near the spot where the trap was found. Paul Freshour had dark hair and wasn't a large man. But Karen's new boyfriend? He was large with sandy hair? And her brother? He drove an El Camino. The police never followed up on this lead. For 10 long years, Paul Freshour sat in prison, maintaining his innocence. Meanwhile, the letters continued to terrorize Circleville. They were so notorious that when the TV show Unsolved Mysteries decided to cover the case in 1993, they received their own threatening message. Forget Circleville, Ohio. If you come to Ohio, you El Sickos will pay. The letters finally stopped in 1994, the same year Paul Freshour was released from prison. But the mystery was far from over. Because in 2021, decades after the first letter arrived in Mary Gillespie's mailbox, a forensic document expert would make a shocking discovery that would turn everything we thought we knew about the case upside down. And what she found, well, that's where our story takes its most surprising turn yet. By 2021, the Circleville Letters case had haunted Ohio for over 4 decades. The mystery had spawned countless theories, destroyed families, and left a town forever changed. But when CBS's 48 Hours brought in forensic document expert Beverly East to examine the letters, no one was prepared for what she would find. East approached the case with fresh eyes, focusing on the tiniest details most people would miss. "Numbers don't lie," she told investigators as she pored over the letters. And in those numbers, she found something fascinating. Looking at Paul Freshour's known writing, she noticed something unique. The way he wrote the letter G. It looked like the number 6, a distinctive quirk that most people wouldn't think twice about. But when she examined the anonymous letters, including one sent while Paul was in prison, there it was. That same unusual G, appearing again and again. But that wasn't all. East discovered nearly 100 distinct writing patterns that matched Paul Freshour's handwriting. Even more shocking, investigators had found Paul's fingerprints on about a dozen letters postmarked while he was incarcerated. The evidence seemed damning. But it also raised an impossible question. How could Paul have sent hundreds of letters while in solitary confinement, stripped of paper and pen, his mail constantly monitored? Former FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole had a different take. After analyzing 98 letters, she suggested the writer might actually be female, someone less educated than Paul Freshour, who held multiple college degrees. The writer seemed to enjoy causing pain, suggesting a personality disorder. This person knew how to blend into the community while harboring dark secrets. While experts debated, the toll of these letters continued to echo through lives. Paul Freshour died in 2012 at age 70, still maintaining his innocence. His son Mark, caught between loyalty to his father and his mother Karen, never visited Paul in prison. In 2002, Mark took his own life, unable to bear the weight of the family's destroyed legacy. Meanwhile, Mary Gillespie and Gordon Massey's relationship ended. The sheriff accused of covering up Ron's death left office. The coroner mentioned in the letters was later charged with multiple sex crimes. And David Longberry, the bus driver Mary initially suspected, was later revealed to be a sexual predator who fled justice. So who really wrote the Circleville letters? Was Paul Freshour an innocent man who spent a decade in prison for a crime he didn't commit? Or was he a master manipulator who somehow managed to continue his reign of terror from behind bars? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Could there have been multiple writers? Could Karen, living in Mary's backyard after losing everything in her divorce, have played a role? What about her boyfriend, who matched the description of the man seen near the booby trap? Today, Circleville is still known for its annual pumpkin show, but beneath the small-town charm lies the shadow of these letters. The case remains officially closed, but the questions linger. As Robin Yoakum, who covered the case as a journalist, put it, "When I'm dead and in my grave, people are going to believe I'm sending those letters." Paul Freshour's prediction came true. His notoriety as the alleged Circleville letter writer has indeed outlived him. What makes this case so haunting isn't just the mystery of who wrote the letters. It's how they expose the dark underbelly of small-town life. How they proved that sometimes the most dangerous threats don't come from strangers but from people we know, trust, and even love. The Circleville letters remind us that in an age before social media, before cyberbullying, someone armed with just a pen, paper, and a stamp could terrorize an entire community. They remind us that sometimes the most chilling mysteries aren't about who committed a crime, but why. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Paul Freshour was the Circleville letter writer? Or was he framed in an elaborate conspiracy? Could there have been multiple writers working together? Share your theories in the comments below. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into unsolved mysteries. And remember, sometimes the scariest stories aren't about what goes bump in the night, but what arrives in your mailbox on a sunny afternoon. Finally, we'll examine the case of Brandon Swanson. They say the most haunting mysteries aren't the ones that shock us with their brutality, but the ones that make us question everything we think we know about reality. How does a 19-year-old college student simply vanish into thin air while talking to his parents on the phone? One moment he's there, the next, silence. And in that silence lies a mystery that has baffled investigators for over 15 years. The case of Brandon Swanson isn't just another missing person story. It's a tale that changed the law, exposed the flaws in how we handle adult disappearances, and left a family forever wondering what happened in those final moments when their son uttered two last words, "Oh shit." But before we dive into the night that changed everything, let me paint you a picture of the person at the center of this mystery. Brandon Swanson was born on January 30th, 1989, in Marshall, Minnesota, a place where everyone knows everyone, and where the vast expanse of rural farmland stretches as far as the eye can see. Growing up as the oldest of two children, Brandon was the kind of kid who made his parents, Brian and Annette, proud. He wasn't just smart, he was the type of person who could light up a room with his sense of humor and had a passion for reading that set him apart. By 2008, at 19 years old, Brandon had found his calling. He enrolled in a wind turbine program at Minnesota West Community and Technical College in Canby, about 30 miles from his home in Marshall. It wasn't just any career choice, it was a path to the future. Brandon had plans to transfer to Iowa Western Community College that fall, where he would major in science. He had dreams, ambitions, and a whole life ahead of him. But sometimes the universe has other plans. May 13th, 2008, started like any other day for Brandon. It was the end of the spring semester, a time when college students everywhere celebrate their temporary freedom from classes. Brandon was no different. He attended two different parties that night, moving between gatherings of friends who were all celebrating the same milestone. Here's where things get interesting, and where the mystery begins to unfold. According to friends who were with Brandon that night, he had been drinking, but not enough to seem visibly intoxicated. This detail would later become crucial as investigators tried to piece together the puzzle of his disappearance. Just before midnight, Brandon decided to head home. The drive from Canby to Marshall was one he knew well. It was the same route he took every day to attend his classes along Minnesota State Highway 68. But for some reason on this night, Brandon chose a different path. Instead of taking the main highway, he opted for the back roads. This decision would prove to be fateful. At around 2 a.m. on May 14th, Brandon's car veered off the road and into a ditch. Uninjured but stuck, he did what most of us would do. He called his parents for help. This is where our story takes its first mysterious turn. Brandon told his parents he was near Lind, a small town roughly 7 miles southwest of Marshall. He could see lights in the distance and was certain of his location. Brian and Annette Swanson jumped into their pickup truck, ready to rescue their son. What should have been a simple late-night pickup was about to become one of Minnesota's most baffling mysteries. For 47 minutes, Brandon remained on the phone with his parents as they tried to locate him. They played a game of lights. Brandon would flash his car lights, and his parents would flash theirs, but neither could see the other's signal. Frustration began to mount. "Don't you see me?" Brandon asked repeatedly, his voice tinged with growing confusion and concern. Finally, Brandon made a decision that would change everything. He told his parents he was going to start walking toward the lights he could see in the distance. He asked them to meet him in the parking lot of a local bar in Lind. There was just one problem. Brandon wasn't anywhere near Lind. At 2:30 a.m., 47 minutes into the call, something happened. Brandon suddenly exclaimed, "Oh shit." Then, silence. The call didn't disconnect. There was just nothing but dead air as his parents desperately called out his name, hoping for a response that would never come. Those two words would be the last anyone would ever hear from Brandon Swanson. When Brian and Annette Swanson reported their son missing at 6:30 a.m. that morning, they ran into a wall that would later change Minnesota law forever. The local police's response was shockingly dismissive. "It's his right to be missing," one officer told the distraught parents, suggesting it wasn't unusual for a young man Brandon's age to stay out all night after the last day of college classes. But Annette knew something was terribly wrong. "I'm his mother," she would later recall, "and I knew something was horribly wrong." What happened next would turn this missing persons case from concerning to baffling. When police finally began investigating and obtained Brandon's cell phone records, they made a startling discovery. Brandon hadn't been anywhere near Lind. He was actually about 25 miles away, near Porter, in a completely different direction. His car was found near Taunton, along State Highway 68, the main route to Canby. But here's where things get even more mysterious. Brandon's car keys were missing. His glasses, crucial for someone legally blind in his left eye, were left behind in the car. His cell phone was nowhere to be found. The car itself appeared undamaged, simply hung up on an incline at the edge of the road, with the wheels on one side barely touching the ground. Lyon County Sheriff Eric Wallen would later describe the scene. "The vehicle simply looked like it was stuck in the ditch, or partially in the ditch. There was nothing odd about it. If a person passed by, they would think it was just parked there or broken down and stuck." What followed was one of the most extensive searches in Minnesota history. Hundreds of volunteers joined forces with law enforcement. Search dogs were brought in. Aircraft scanned the vast landscape from above. But the rural terrain of southwestern Minnesota proved to be both friend and foe to the search efforts. The search dogs picked up a trail. And this is where our mystery takes another bizarre turn. The canines followed Brandon's scent for about 3 miles, tracking a path that led them through field roads, past an abandoned farm and straight to the Yellow Medicine River. But they didn't stop at the water's edge. The dogs crossed to the other side, continued along the riverbank to another gravel road, and then headed north toward the Yellow Medicine County line before the trail went cold. This discovery aligned with something Brandon had mentioned during that final phone call. He told his father he could hear water nearby and had been crossing fences. But if Brandon had fallen into the river, where was his body? Despite extensive searches of the waterway, including the use of special gates to catch any evidence moving downstream, nothing was found. Think about that for a moment. No keys, no phone, no glasses, no clothing, no Brandon. It was as if he had simply vanished into the Minnesota night. But here's where our story takes yet another frustrating turn. As the investigation continued, search teams encountered an unexpected obstacle, one that continues to hinder efforts to this day. Several landowners in the area refused to allow search teams access to their property. Ken Anderson of Emergency Support Services, who has been involved in the search efforts for years, expressed his frustration. In at least a couple of circumstances, that problem is still in existence. They will not allow us on their property. We don't dispute the reason why. We try and work out a method that would make it acceptable, and we've not been able to come up with a working compromise. This wasn't just a minor setback. These restricted areas included land where search dogs had repeatedly indicated the presence of human remains, particularly near Mud Creek, north of Porter. But without access to these properties, investigators' hands were tied. The situation became even more complex when considering the agricultural nature of the area. Search teams had to work around planting and harvest seasons, creating an intricate dance of timing and permission that left gaps in their search efforts. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, theories about Brandon's disappearance began to surface. Some pointed to the numerous unmarked cisterns in the area. Could Brandon have fallen into one of these in the darkness? Others noted the temperature that night was just under 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Could hypothermia have played a role if he had gotten wet crossing the river? But there was something else that made this case particularly puzzling. Despite having been at parties earlier that night, Brandon's parents insisted that during their 47-minute phone conversation, he sounded completely lucid. He wasn't confused or disoriented, at least not until those final moments. Sometimes tragedy becomes the catalyst for change. In the aftermath of Brandon's disappearance, Annette and Brian Swanson refused to let their son's case become just another statistic. They were haunted by those early morning hours when law enforcement dismissed their concerns simply because their son was an adult. They took their fight to the Minnesota state legislature, and what emerged was Brandon's Law, a piece of legislation that would fundamentally change how missing persons cases are handled in Minnesota. The law requires police to conduct immediate preliminary investigations when adults go missing under dangerous circumstances, regardless of age. Marty Seifert, who was the minority leader of the State House of Representatives at the time, recalls meeting with Annette at a local restaurant. She knew it wouldn't help in her son's case, he remembered, but that it could help others in the future. The path to passing the law wasn't easy. Law enforcement initially pushed back, particularly concerning privacy issues and cell phone tracking. But in May 2009, Governor Tim Pawlenty signed Brandon's Law into effect, with the Swansons and their daughter Jamin present at the ceremony. "I consider it one of the most important bills I authored in my 14 years, Seifert would later say. It will save lives. Fast forward to today, and Brandon's case remains active. Sheriff Eric Wallen confirms that tips continue to come in, including some intriguing leads within the last year. Some of these tips suggest Brandon may have been involved in an argument around the time he disappeared. But like so many leads before, these too have led to dead ends. It seems that every tip that we receive we investigate and we run into a dead end, Wallen explains. It was either false or the information wasn't accurate. They all seem to run into a dead end. The search efforts haven't stopped either. As recently as 2021, during a drought that lowered water levels, excavation teams were still sifting through the dirt along the Yellow Medicine River. But the challenges of searching with specialized canines have only grown more complex with time. The problem is that as time goes on, it becomes much more complicated to fulfill the search because you need to have canines that have experience in aged scent, Anderson explains. In the entire state of Minnesota, there are only about 3 dogs with the capability to detect scents as old as Brandon's trail. For the Swanson family, time hasn't made their loss any easier to bear. They've had to learn to live with questions that may never be answered. What made Brandon suddenly exclaim, "Oh shit"? What did he see or encounter in those final moments? And perhaps most haunting of all, where is he? The fact that not a single piece of physical evidence, not his phone, not his keys, not a scrap of clothing, has ever been found, only deepens the mystery. Brandon's case has even been added to VICAP, a database typically reserved for violent crimes, suggesting investigators haven't ruled out foul play. Brandon Swanson's disappearance has left an indelible mark on Minnesota. Beyond the law that bears his name, his case has become a sobering reminder of how quickly and mysteriously a life can vanish, even in our modern, connected world. It's forced us to confront uncomfortable questions about how we handle missing persons cases and the limitations of our search capabilities. Today, 4 other states have passed laws similar to Brandon's Law, creating a ripple effect that continues to help families of missing persons across the country. While this may be little consolation to the Swansons, it means their son's disappearance has potentially saved other lives and spared other families the initial dismissal they encountered. As we conclude this deep dive into one of Minnesota's most perplexing mysteries, we're left with more questions than answers. How does someone vanish without a trace while on the phone with their parents? What happened in those final moments before Brandon went silent? And will we ever know the truth? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case. What do you think happened to Brandon Swanson that night? Do you believe he met with foul play? Or was his disappearance the result of a tragic accident? Leave your theories in the comments below and let's discuss this baffling case. And if you found this story as compelling as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into mysterious disappearances and unsolved cases. Your support helps us continue to shed light on these important stories. Remember, Brandon's case remains open. If you have any information about his disappearance, please contact the Lyon County Sheriff's Office or the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. Sometimes all it takes is one small detail to crack a case wide open. That concludes our look at these mysterious cases. Thank you for joining us as we explored the unknown. Stay tuned for more cases in future episodes, and remember, the truth is out there waiting to be uncovered.